Hello, and welcome to the first installment of a new series here on Radio K. I'm Adam Kadri. There's a family of webcomics that I've been following for ages now. They're all written and drawn by a guy named John Allison. His first comic was called Bobbins, but that was before my time. I started reading his second one. It was called Scary Go Round, and it was drawn in Adobe Illustrator. Then one day he decided to draw a few strips by hand, and to separate those strips from the regular run, he called the hand-drawn version of the comic Calen-deliria. Basically the same stuff, slightly different format. So around the same time Bobbins started up, I added a section to my website that I guess most people today would call a blog, but that word hadn't caught on yet when I started it. At least, I'd never heard of it, so I called it my calendar page. And this audio series is Calen-deliria. It's a sporadic little spin-off that covers the material that I normally put on my calendar page, but every so often, instead of writing an article, I'll record a conversation. Again, basically the same stuff, slightly different format. So one thing I do on my calendar page is to put together a list of movies from a given year. For most of the 2010s, I've chosen them by starting with the winners of the Scandi Awards, which are given by a group of online movie critics organized by Mike D'Angelo. And then I catch up on the Marvel movies from that year just because I imprinted on Marvel Comics as a kid. I've fallen behind. Here it is the second half of 2017, and I'm only just now getting to the movies of 2014. And for 2014, I decided to start with the Marvel movies, mainly because I was eager to talk to Stacey Tappan about Captain America 2, The Winter Soldier. And here she is.
Hello.
Stacey's a regular contributor to my other series here on Radio K, which is called Ask Tell and is about interactive fiction. Here's a clip from that show introducing her. So, you say you lost track of IF in 2005 because your career took over? So, before we rejoin the world of 2005 and talk about tough beans, I have to ask, what's it like to be an opera singer?
It's normal for me, but a lot of people are like, what is that like? And I'm not sure what to say.
I know, it's kind of a weird question. What's it like to be an opera singer? It's like, well, I've never been a construction worker, so...
No, I haven't had a regular job since grad school, so I wouldn't even know how I would do in like an office situation nowadays. But I will say it's tremendously fulfilling to do something that I really, really love. When I sing, I feel like I'm using my body and my talent to its full potential, and that is a wonderful feeling. I feel lucky that I'm able to make a career of it, and I'm grateful for every single opportunity that I get to share it.
And we're back.
Hi.
So, as for me, I'm a writer. I have one novel that's been published and another in progress, and I've also written some screenplays, including one for a superhero movie, though thanks to an NDA, I'm not allowed to say which one. I've also written a bunch of interactive fiction. It was through that community that I met Stacey back in the day. So every so often, people will email me out of the blue to say that they've read and liked something that I've written. Usually this is about my old stuff. Someone will say, "Hey, I just reread your book, and I wanted to say how much it's meant to me over the years." And my response is always something along the lines of, "Wow, thanks. What about it spoke to you?" Because for me, making these kinds of connections is the whole point of writing anything. I mean, not the whole point. Some of it is just to get these stories out of my head. But yeah, it's like the narrative lobe of my brain generates these stories based on my life experience, and mainly I want to know if there's anyone out there who can relate to this stuff. But in the vast majority of cases when these people write back, they say things like, "Oh, I thought it was funny, and I liked the characters." And I'm thinking, okay, that's a very kind review, and I'm grateful for the praise, but it doesn't tell me what struck a chord with you.
Yeah.
As an example of what I mean, one of my favorite books when I was 16 was Ender's Game. I don't really like it anymore, but at the time it really resonated with me. Like, I knew what it was like to be years younger than the other kids at school. And my little sister had died when we were very young, so I'm a sucker for stories with strong brother-sister relationships. I even like the way that the author spells out what everyone's thinking, because I had never been really good at picking up subtext, and this stylistic choice allowed me the instant insight into other human beings that more empathic people take for granted. These were the sorts of things that made the story work for teenage me in particular. And that's the sort of thing that I'm interested in exploring on this show.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we'll talk about the virtues and the flaws of whatever book or movie we happen to be talking about.
Right.
But mainly, I want to focus on what speaks to individual people, especially when that might be unexpected to some.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's one thing to talk about the winners of the Cannes Film Festival or the Oscars or the Scandies, but it's another thing to talk about Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which I think is the sort of movie that most people go into just looking for a good time.
Yeah, popcorn.
Yeah, a summer roller coaster.
There you go.
And it's true that the Marvel movies have a reputation for being good examples of that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd take it a step further. I'd say that Iron Man is actually one of the best movies of the 2000s, up there with Mulholland Drive and Summer Hours.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't automatically dismiss The Winter Soldier the way that I would if someone said, oh, my favorite movie is Transformers 3.
Oh, Lord.
But still, when I'm at lunch and an accomplished, jet-setting adult woman tells me that Captain America 2 was deeply meaningful to her, I mean, how can you not have a show about that?
Well, this happens with movies very rarely, I think. You know, it's weird. It involves a certain alchemy. I mean, it has to be about something I'm interested in. It has to be a well-crafted movie, well-acted, good production effects. That all contributes, although it's not entirely necessary. But also, it has to resonate with you personally for some reason. And the timing is important. When you encounter a movie can have a lot to do with whether it's just an entertaining movie or one that you really take to heart, that you take personally. And Winter Soldier was that way for me.
That's a really good point about the timing. My favorite movie is Pleasantville, but the first time I saw it, I didn't even like it all that much. I thought the special effects were cool, but the story left me cold. Because I couldn't really appreciate scenes of people experiencing joyous liberation as their world turned to color, while my life was still pretty much black and white. You know, I'd gone from a childhood and adolescence that was jam-packed with negative emotions to an adulthood with basically no emotions. And it was only in my late 20s, after I'd finally experienced at least a tiny bit of affection and excitement in my life, that I learned what I'd been missing and what the people in the movie were feeling. And after that, I basically couldn't watch Pleasantville again without crying my way through it.
Wow.
In a good way.
There you go. See? So shall I say why it's important for me?
Absolutely. But first, there may be some people listening who haven't seen The Winter Soldier, so why don't you get them caught up?
All right. So, Captain America: Winter Soldier, Captain America's second solo film. In the first movie, he was a soldier in World War II. He got frozen in ice, and he was resurrected. In the Avengers, he joined the Avengers and fought with them. And in this movie, he has joined S.H.I.E.L.D., which fights alien and superhero type threats. And he is trying to make his way in the modern world, having grown up in the 30s and 40s. And what comes out is, massive spoilers for the movie, this organization turns out to be run underground by the organization that he was fighting in World War II, Hydra, the evil organization that's the Nazi analog. And they have his best friend, Bucky, from the first movie, who we thought had died, but it turns out he did not die. His mind was wiped and he was turned into a super soldier and is working for Hydra. So the movie is about him discovering all these revelations, figuring out a way to get Hydra, and figuring out a way to rescue his friend. How's that for a recap?
Works for me. So, now for the question that this episode is all about. How did you end up finding an important emotional touchstone for you in a movie about unfrozen super soldiers and mind-wiped cyborgs?
When this movie was about to come out, I hadn't really been all that interested in Captain America. I watched the Iron Man movies and loved them. I watched the Avengers mainly because Iron Man was in it and loved it. I didn't watch either of the Thor movies. But when this movie was coming out, there was a big deal made about how it was tying in to Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and that there would be a big thing that happened in the movie that would have an impact and big things happening on the TV show. Now, I hadn't been watching the TV show either, but this intrigued me. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to get all caught up on the TV show before I went in to see the movie, and then I would be able to enjoy the synergy. So I watched the first Captain America movie, which I had no idea that it was a period film. I watched all of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. up until that point, and then I went to watch this movie. Now, also in my life, what had been happening, I had split up with my husband about a year before this movie came out. It was an emotionally abusive relationship. I had sort of squelched my own self-expression and my own preferences in the interest of avoiding conflict in the relationship. And that frustrated him more, and he came after me more, and I hid more and hid more. So when I was trying to recover from this, I was trying to figure out who I was again. I was trying to establish a sort of sense of identity, listen to my gut the way I had taught myself not to during my marriage. So a movie about someone who is also struggling to find their way. And there are a lot of people actually in this movie struggling to find their way, not only Captain America, but I think also Natasha, the spy that he works with, who's Black Widow, and his new friend, Sam Wilson, who becomes the Falcon. But also Bucky is fighting his programming, and bits of it are coming through, and he is starting to remember, because of Captain America's efforts, his past life, and that war is going on within him. So it hit me at a time when that theme was especially resonant for me, when I was going on a journey of discovery, when I was going on a journey of trying to come back from something that had hurt and made me feel small, to feeling like myself again, to feeling like a person with preferences and loves and passions and enthusiasm for life. So this movie hit me like a ton of bricks because of that. It's a good movie. It's a solid movie. It's well made. I think it is particularly well made, but also the emotion in it is very strong. The emotional stakes are very high and really amazingly well painted. I mean, Steve Rogers' loneliness and then his hope and desperation when he discovers that Bucky is alive again is so poignant, so well acted, and so well presented. And you are just rooting for him to break through to Bucky, like the whole time, all the way. Your heart breaks for this guy. So it was a very strong emotional message at a time when I really needed that.
Now, what surprises me about what you just said is that you told me some of this already. I mean, that's what gave me the idea of doing this episode in the first place. But when you first mentioned it at lunch that time, I hadn't seen the movie yet, but I had read the Winter Soldier comics, so I knew the story. And I just assumed that the parallels you saw were with Bucky Barnes and how he has his identity overwritten by the bad guys. But now it sounds like you're talking just as much about Cap himself.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Cap is certainly who I related to the most in this movie. And I guess I should make clear that I did not really connect with this movie the way that you did. I mean, it was fine, but to me it was just a movie. But there are a few moments in the movie about Cap starting to rebuild a life after being frozen in World War II and then revived in the 21st century. And in the comics, there are all sorts of people from Cap's era who are still around, like Namor and the original Human Torch and the Howling Commandos. So he has lots of folks like that to hang out with. But that's not true in the cinematic universe, right? Or is it? There's a lot of it I haven't seen.
In Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., there was a character who was like a grandson of one of the Howling Commandos. So I'm pretty sure that either none of the Howling Commandos are around or they're just off screen.
Okay. And Peggy's still alive, but she's over 90 and not all there, really. So Cap has to start over from, if not square one, then like square 1.2. And that is where I was when this movie came out, and where I basically still am. In 2012 through 2014, I had this sort of slow-motion chain collision breakup, which was my fault, so it's a different situation from yours. But they say that in such times, you should lean on your circle of friends.
Mm-hmm.
What they don't say is what to do when your entire circle of friends consists of the person you're breaking up with.
So now what?
Yeah, I mean, I still had Facebook friends, but no one I talked to every day. Quite a few people who would take my calls, but not too many people who would actually call me up. So the idea of having to start over and build a new life is very familiar to me.
Yeah.
It's been 3 to 5 years now, depending on when you start counting, and I've had a few false starts, but nothing is really taken yet. So anyway, this is all a typically long-winded way of saying that I could relate to Cap.
Sure.
But it sounds like you're saying that you could relate to all 4 main characters. Because even though this is called a Captain America movie, it's more like a mini Avengers movie with the Black Widow and the Falcon in the mix.
Exactly, yeah.
And while I get the resonances you saw with Bucky, I wondered what resonances you saw with the other 3.
It feels like Cap, Sam, and Natasha, all to some extent, are trying to find their way. They're trying to find their direction after something momentous has happened to them. In Cap's case, all his friends are dead or dying, and he is alone in a strange world, and he's trying to make the best of it, but he's really kind of lost. And for Sam, it's losing his partner and rebuilding his life that way, having gone through PTSD and trauma and stuff like that. For Natasha, it's trying to overcome her past, trying to be a better person, inspired by Cap, and being ashamed of where she was before. So I feel like they're all kind of flavors of the same finding your way. For me, what got me about Cap in this movie was that even though he was kind of at sea, and even though he was probably about as despairing as we would ever see him, he still tries. Even though he's discouraged and he talks to Peggy about how he's trying, but he's just not feeling it, he still does something. He never just throws up his hands and goes off to live on an island somewhere, you know. We don't see him like sitting in his apartment with stubble and a bottle of scotch in his hand. We see him going out running and making new friends and keeping a list of the things that he has to learn about. And that's really a lovely sentiment. He just does not give up. Giving up is not in his vocabulary. Even when he's discouraged and he feels that discouragement, it's just a challenge that needs to be met. So that was an inspiring message for me to hear at that point. You know, with Bucky, it was the fact that he was struggling with this. With Steve, it was the fact that he was facing it.
Okay, now there's something I want to respond to in there, but it needs a little bit of setup.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember that when we were talking about this right before we did the Luminous Horizons segment in Ask Tell number 9, you mentioned how one distinctive feature of the Marvel movies is that each series is in a different genre.
Exactly.
Like Thor is sword and sorcery, and Guardians of the Galaxy is comedic space opera, and of course the first Captain America movie is a World War II movie.
And this one, Winter Soldier, is a 70s style spy thriller with all the aesthetic that entails. I mean, even Natasha's hair reflects the style of the time. Even though it's set in the modern day, you get like all this gray and concrete, which was very much the aesthetic of those movies. You get car chases, you get intrigue, and a sort of a more realistic camera style. There's some shaky cam going on. And also, I think the music kind of reflected that as well. But when it's a good movie, well acted, with good production values, tightly told story, and it's also got this very clear style and point of view, that makes it twice as interesting because you can also see, oh, they're doing an homage to da-da-da. Oh, this is 3 Days of the Condor. It doesn't make the movie on its own, but added to the other elements, it elevates a good movie to a terrific movie.
So I've seen a few of those 70s political thrillers that you mentioned, but I actually want to talk about the Captain America comic in the 70s. So are you familiar with the Secret Empire storyline?
Are you referring to the time that he became Nomad?
Yes.
Okay, yes. But why don't you go through it for those listeners at home that haven't heard it?
All right, well, the short version is that there's an evil organization that wants to take over the U.S. It's called the Secret Empire, and its members all wear hoods with numbers on them to indicate their rank within the Secret Empire hierarchy. Like Gabe Jones goes undercover as number 68. So finally Cap defeats the Secret Empire and corners number 1, rips off his hood, and discovers that the leader of the Secret Empire is Richard Nixon, who was still the president of the United States at the time, but who resigned about 3 months after this issue came out. In the comic, he kills himself. He shoots himself in the Oval Office right in front of Captain America. He says, "High political office didn't satisfy me. My power was still too constrained by legalities. I gambled on a coup to gain me the power I craved, and it appears that my gamble has finally failed. I'll cash my chips then." Yeah, it's a storyline for the Watergate era. I mean, all superheroes reflect the era in which their adventures are published.
Exactly.
But when you're called Captain America, then yeah, you're going to be a commentary on the state of the U.S. And in 1974, Cap was like the real American public in grappling with the discovery that the president was a villain. What could it possibly be like to live in such a time?
Just imagine.
Anyway, so this pretty much was the storyline that you alluded to earlier. I mean, he doesn't go all the way to whiskey and stubble, but he's so shattered by what he's seen that he gives up being Captain America and...
But does he? Not really, because he becomes Nomad and he fights for good undercover. I mean, he's not titled Captain America, but he's still doing the same things he was. He still sees injustice and wants to fight it.
Right, but he does it as Nomad, the man without a country.
Yep. Which is such a 70s aesthetic for the kids with their Vietnam War protests. He is the Captain America for an age when everybody was really questioning America and its motives. So it doesn't have anything to do with him as a character. It has to do with him rejecting the fact that he aligned himself with America, the nation. But inside, he's still the same guy. It doesn't change him.
Well, I'd say that alignment with America the nation is the historical artifact that makes Captain America's place in the Marvel Universe interestingly weird. Like, DC has Superman. You know, he's the big blue Boy Scout. He's the bright, shiny daylight hero who gets contrasted with Batman, the Dark Knight. And Captain America is like Batman in that he doesn't have any superhuman powers. You know, the super soldier serum brought him to peak human potential, but not beyond, just like Batman's ninja training did. But personality-wise, Cap has historically been Marvel's big blue Boy Scout. He doesn't kill, he doesn't lie, he's flustered around sexually forward women. After a workout, he literally drinks a glass of milk. But the twist is that he wears the flag. Marvel has taken this sort of wholesome innocence and said, he's not that way because he's an alien from a more enlightened planet. He's not that way because he's a Kansas farm boy. He's a soldier. He's a hyper-competent soldier from New York City, but yet he somehow takes on these Boy Scout qualities because for at least one generation of writers, that was the essence of Americanness.
So one of the reasons that I didn't watch the Captain America movie when it came out was because I was aware of this stereotypical straight-laced Boy Scout character of Cap, and it did nothing for me. I was really not interested in watching any sort of adventure that had to deal with straight-laced Boy Scout going into battle and fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. And the movies really focus on who he was before the serum and make the point that the serum didn't change anything internally, anything about his actual character. So when we first see him in the first Captain America movie, he's this skinny little guy who desperately wants to stand up and fight for the little guy and fight against bullies and fight against people being disrespectful and wrong and doing bad things, but does not have the body to back it up and does it anyway, even though he knows he's just going to get hurt. He has a very powerful sense of compassion and of justice, of right and wrong, and he cares deeply about that. So when he becomes big, it doesn't affect how he acts. He still acts like this little guy who cares very deeply about right and wrong, about people being good, and everything that he does, all the things that he pursues in service of that are because of who he is. And that never changes in these movies. It's always there. He can come up against obstacles, but he is just going to keep fighting through them because that is who he is. And it's not in a stuck-up, conservative type of way. It's in a compassionate way, which changes the entire dynamic. So instead of being like rigidly stuck in the past and, old-fashioned Cap, it's because he cares about what's right and good. He cares about people suffering. He cares about setting things straight. That's a beautiful character. And Chris Evans, I think, strikes just the right balance in this. So while I don't really care for any of the comics Caps all that much because they appear a little bit too grown up and stuck in their ways, this Cap seems like a sensitive soul in a strong body.
Well, one of the most striking things about the Iron Man movie was that you didn't watch it for Iron Man. You watched it for Tony Stark. And it reinvented Tony Stark as way more interesting than he'd ever been in the comics. And it seems like the Captain America movies have tried to do the same thing for Steve Rogers. But what feels oddly missing to me is that, yeah, they emphasize that before the serum he was this never-give-up little guy. But why? In the comics, we get references to the fact that his father was an alcoholic and that home is where he learned to take a beating. But in the movies, with all their emphasis on Steve Rogers' personality, I would expect some sort of exploration of what formed that personality. But so far, I haven't seen it.
In a way, it doesn't matter why he is the way he is. What matters is that he cares. But this ties into another thing, which is that in a Captain America movie, because this is a character that has this unshakable moral code, stories with him will end up butting up against that moral code, but it's not going to make him question it. Because if he actually questioned his moral code, then he wouldn't be who he is anymore. And there are a lot of gray areas in the modern day world. And they actually kind of touch on this a little bit in the movie, where he's like, oh, we have these giant helicarriers that will shoot people that they think are a threat from far away without knowing. And he feels like that's bad and dishonest and not right. So you see him kind of struggling with this a little bit. And then it turns out that it's Hydra, so it's the bad guys and he can fight against them. But when it was the good guys, he has a really hard time with that. But that's not resolvable as a Captain America story. He has to maintain his faith and inspire other people. Cap's power in stories is his power to change other people. His power to, through the force of his goodness, make other people good or destroy the bad guys or whatever. That's what we want to see. If we saw a movie about Captain America losing his faith and like sitting on the sofa, stubble, scotch in hand, I don't think it would be satisfying, because that's not why we watch him. We watch him to be inspired ourselves.
Well, I've read plenty of comics in which Cap's role is to inspire everyone. Things look hopeless, and he gives a big speech about how they're not beaten yet, and one of the other heroes thinks, it sounds pretty corny, but somehow he makes you believe it. As for the notion that he inspires others to change but doesn't change himself, one of the most common storylines in all superhero comics is to replace the hero.
Mm-hmm.
You know, after they've been kicking around for a few decades, they're not growing or changing anymore, and you always know what they're going to do. So you bring in someone new to take up the mantle, and things get less predictable. At least for a while. The first Captain America storyline I ever collected was one of these. It was from the late 80s. The government brings in Steve Rogers and says, you are not Captain Avenger, or Captain Shield, or Captain Solo. You're Captain America. We own your shield and your costume, so if you want to keep using them, you have to work for us, and go to Nicaragua and fight alongside the Contras. And Steve thinks about it overnight and talks to some people, and comes back and says, nope, and he turns in his shield and costume, and the government brings in John Walker, the Super Patriot, to take over as Captain America. Well, Steve Rogers puts on a black costume and calls himself just the Captain. So, just like in the 70s, Steve's still out there fighting bad guys, but what interests me is how the author, Mark Grunwald, was responding to his historical moment. You know, like I said, this was the 80s. Reagan and the Republicans had spent a decade pounding the idea that patriotism belonged to the conservatives, and liberals were all commie finks, or, you know, at best they were cosmopolitan globalists. Now that sort of thing doesn't really bother me because I'm not an American patriot. You know, the flag I identify with is not the Stars and Stripes. My flag has one star, one stripe, and a bear. But liberal patriots in the 80s were furious at how they were being smeared. So Mark Grunwald had Steve Rogers, the Roosevelt Democrat, and John Walker, the Reagan Republican, spend a year and a half on parallel tracks, and the moral of the story was that Walker was an incompetent psycho, and Steve was the one who truly represented America. And you can't tell that story if he started out as Captain Avenger. And another thing that's interesting to me is that I may have imprinted on the Boy Scout Cap who says, I don't represent the American government, I represent the American dream. But I have to say, he hasn't been written that way in a long time.
Nope.
Right after 9/11, you had these edgelord writers like Mark Miller who came in and said, why are you writing Cap like the 1940s were a more innocent time? Cap wouldn't be a Boy Scout. He's a soldier from the olden days when men were men. He'd think the modern world needs a boot up its ass. So for most of the W years, Cap was written as this old-fashioned conservative guy who said things like, "Surrender? You think this letter on my head stands for France?" And I'd say that all in all, more than any other superhero, the way you write Captain America reflects your take on your era.
So it's telling that the movie Cap, the one for the modern era, in this first story about Captain America in the modern era, has to do with confusion over who exactly we're fighting for, the change in battlefields from hand-to-hand combat to like drones, and alliances that are unclear. It's hard to find out who exactly your allies are. There's all this behind-the-scenes wrangling going on. It came out several years before all of this Russia nonsense reared its head, but that is very much about dealing behind the scenes and who are we actually in bed with and that sort of thing. So it's him struggling with that and eventually struggling against it. And I think it's also telling that his compassion has such a forward role, that his caring about the country is so put into relief in these movies, that is kind of what we are longing for as a country right now, is for people to care about each other.
Okay, so now that you've heroically pulled us out of the 70s and 80s and back onto the topic of this movie, let's talk about the Winter Soldier. In the comics, the Winter Soldier story arc began with the January 2005 issue of Captain America. In it, we learn that Bucky Barnes, thought to have been killed in 1945, was actually recovered by the Soviets and revived, although he had brain damage that had wiped out his memory. The Soviets train him as an assassin, but because he has a tendency to start to discard his programming when left on his own for too long, they end up sticking him in a cryonic tube and thawing him out for missions, and years go by between these missions so he doesn't actually age that much. After the fall of the Soviet Union, he's put into a deep freeze, and isn't thawed out again until the modern day when he's transferred to a new operator who brings him into conflict with Cap. Cap tries to get through to him, but nothing works until he pulls a Deus Ex Machina and uses a cosmic cube to recover Bucky's memories. Now, what surprised me about the movie is that it only covered the first act of the comic storyline. In the movie, we never learn what Bucky got up to in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And at the end of the movie, he still hasn't completely recovered. I found myself thinking, so what, am I supposed to wait for the next movie to get this resolved, or does this all lead into the TV show, or what? Where do I get Act 2 and Act 3?
I think the choice not to show what Bucky went through, like you did in the comics, was a good one. I went and read the whole Winter Soldier comic. Did I read it before or after I saw the movie? I think I read it after I saw the movie. And I was a little disappointed that we got to see Bucky go through all the things that he went through with Hydra. In the comics, he has a lot more autonomy. He has a lot more decision-making power. He proposes missions to the powers that be and stuff like that. He's essentially a fully brained, fully engaged Hydra agent.
Well, in the comics, he's a Soviet agent.
Soviet agent, that's correct.
In the movies, he's Hydra, which makes me wonder why he's still got the red star on his arm.
So anyway, regardless of who he's serving them he's not serving them willingly. They erased his memory, but after they erased his memory, he's totally happy to go along with it. But in the movie, he's kind of this brainwashed, memory erased pawn that they have to keep on ice, and they have to put him through this painful brain resetting machine. He's hooked up to all of this equipment. So however much they altered him, they weren't able to alter him enough to get his unquestioning loyalty, and they've got to do a lot of maintenance to keep it up. There is this body horror story in the movie where it is clear that they are doing horrible things to him. I mean, part of it is, the severing of his arm and the revelation of a new one. That is one of the few flashback scenes we get. And the first thing he does is strangle a scientist with it. And you get this sense of horror of seeing his arm as metal and very strong. Also, the sense that these mad scientists are tinkering with his brain, that they're giving him all these drugs. They plug him into this machine and actually have electrodes on his head, and he's screaming. It hurts. And this suggests a path of unimaginable horror and pain that I think is more powerful if you don't go into detail, if you leave it up to people's imagination. Because he comes back from this one mission and he's starting to remember things, and he's starting to get back, and they slap him across the face, they stick him in the machine, he's screaming. And meanwhile, the scientists are acting like this is an everyday occurrence. You see him getting frozen, and that's a little terrifying, because you see him looking at his own reflection in the glass of the coffin-like enclosure that they freeze him in. All of this is horrific and breaks away a little bit from the spy story to like an actual horror story. It makes your heart go out to him. It makes you root for him to recover his memory. It makes it absolutely clear that he's a good guy that has been badly abused and used by this evil organization. And it makes him worthy to be Cap's friend again. You don't feel the same sort of attachment to him in the comics when you see him essentially living a normal soldier life and going out and doing stuff for the Soviets and being proud of his actions, as opposed to this monosyllabic, forced into service automaton that they've got working for them in the movies. I think that story just grabs your gut a little bit more. What do you think, having read the comics first?
I think that in the comics, the reader's attachment to Bucky was meant to have been established not by the Winter Soldier story arc itself, even though it does have a lot of flashbacks, but just by the fact that Bucky had been a published character since 1940. He was a regular in the Captain America comics until they were canceled in 1954, though later he was said to have been killed in 1945, and the 50s Bucky was retconned to be Jack Monroe, who became the second Nomad. But when Captain America was revived at the end of 1963, the fact that Bucky was not revived was crucial to Cap's new status quo. He spent pretty much every waking moment sitting around sulking about the fact that Bucky was dead.
I have a collection, actually, of screen caps from the comics in which basically it's just Cap angsting about Bucky. There's so many of them. It's kind of a cliche.
Yeah, he takes on Rick Jones as his partner because he's like, "You look like Bucky."
Yep.
That is some serious Vertigo action right there.
He's got some issues.
He got over it to a certain extent as time went on, but he spent basically the whole 1960s going, "Oh my god, Bucky is dead. How can I go on? Bucky, where are you, man?" But for decade after decade, Bucky stayed dead. It became a cliche that in Marvel Comics, every dead character comes back except for Uncle Ben.
And Bucky Barnes. Yep.
Yep. Or to put it another way, the entire baby boom generation was born after Bucky was dead. And by the time he was revived, they were well above the average age of a new grandparent. Because it's not just in the story that he was gone for 60 years. He actually was gone for 60 years in real life. Or 51 years if you count 1950s Bucky. And real time matters. You just can't have the same impact by killing off Bucky in 2011 and bringing him back in 2014. And here's another thing. The Marvel Universe has, I'm guessing, tens of thousands of characters. So if you're reading Captain America in 2005 and you're trying to figure out who could this Winter Soldier be, there are actually dozens of reasonable candidates. But in the movie, who else could it be if not Bucky?
Well, I mean, it could be somebody totally new, but probably not.
Yeah, it could either be somebody totally new, or...
It was got to be Bucky.
I mean, I guess it could be Tony Stark.
Steve Rogers' evil alter ego.
Actually, that's not bad.
There you go, see?
They've done that.
They've done everything.
That's actually a really good point. You got me there. It could have been Chris Evans under the mask.
There you go.
Because you know how in the Secret Empire storyline from the 70s, the big level boss bad guy was finally revealed as Richard Nixon?
Mm-hmm.
In the 80s Super Patriot storyline, the big bad guy behind the commission was revealed to be Steve Rogers. But it is the Red Skull in a Steve Rogers clone body.
Oh my god. Comics.
But I want to get back to your point that you didn't want to see everything that the comics showed, because you thought it was more effective to just let the audience imagine the unseen parts of Bucky's missing years?
Exactly. Whatever we could come up with is 100 times more horrible than anything they could come up with.
And that reminds me of Scott McCloud's observation in Understanding Comics that, and I'm quoting here, When you look at a photo or realistic drawing of a face, you see it as the face of another. But when you enter the world of the cartoon, you see yourself. And I found that that sort of thing goes beyond art styles. I remember reading a discussion of this on the forum for the webcomic Scary Go Round, in which the creator, John Allison, said, "What always interests me is how readers will invest the most paper-thin characters with things that I never saw in them. You may laugh, but to me, Desmond was an infinitely more rounded character than the boy, who was pretty much just a cipher." Which was true. The boy was a generic geek boy who didn't even have a name for the first 3 years he was in the comic. He was just the boy.
The boy.
While Desmond was an infantile, cowardly, tantrum-throwing merman with green scales and webbed hands and feet, and he also had like a taste for the high life. And one of the readers replied, and here's a long quote, "That's interesting. To me, having been through numerous relationships with girls I never would have expected to find myself with, always fallen hard, always knowing that, despite my optimism, it really couldn't end well, the boy gave me a great many things to invest myself in. Even a sort of, 'Hello, young alter self. I hope this works out better for you than it did me.' But this may be the crux. When you say, readers will invest the most paper-thin characters with things that I never saw in them, it's because readers see themselves in those characters. You, not being the reader, do not, and to an extent, cannot, see those same things. I identify with his fears and his elation. I know his girlfriend, and am invested in that relationship. I know his parents and friends. I know what it is to finish school and leave home, leaving those you love and launching yourself into an uncertain future. Conversely, Desmond Fishman is a fish." And to me, that was a perfect parallel to looking at the cartoon smiley face and seeing yourself. This guy looked at an empty vessel of a character and thought, "My lord, that's me."
Yep.
And he was totally aware that that was what he was doing. He wrote flat out that he was projecting himself into the character, and he wanted the chance to do it some more. And I feel like that's what this movie does with Bucky. It gives us the bare minimum and hopes that we'll fill in the rest. And while I can't say that I never ever do anything like that, it does seem like I'm in the bottom percentiles for this kind of thing. You know, I read books and watch movies and things for the author's content, not for mine. My headcanon is unloaded. And that brings us to fanfic. So, Stacey, what's the deal with fanfic?
Fanfic is basically what comes up when you see a story, it speaks to you in a very deep way, and you are asking questions about the universe of the story. In geek fashion, as we do, we obsess over details. We go, okay, but like where was he coming from when he came to this store? Or, what was he thinking when this happened? The look in his eyes suggested that there was something deeper going on or what have you. Sometimes it's an actor's portrayal that does this, where an actor will like bring some depth or hidden emotion to it. And you're like, ooh, I wonder what the story is there. Or like with Bucky and his torture at the hands of Hydra, you wonder what else went on. You get like this tantalizing glimpse of it and you go, Jesus Christ, what has the last 60, 75, I don't remember how many years done to this guy? What have they done to him in all that time? So I was feeling this after I saw Winter Soldier, and I actually dove into the fanfic community because I wanted more. I wanted more stories about this situation. And there are two things that I feel like people especially glommed onto, or at least two things that I sought out and that I found a lot of. And one was imagining what the hell happened to Bucky during all those years in vivid, sometimes pornographic detail. Granted, some of it is self-gratifying and what have you. But I think Bucky's story speaks to a lot of people who have lost their autonomy in one way or another. Like I kind of felt like I had lost mine. People that have been raped, people that have had trauma. And a lot of stories that I found had him suffering through these things. Not so much the recovery, because we see him breaking out of it. We see like the end result. So in a way, it makes it a little bit safer to explore. What does your imagination dredge up when you imagine the worst possible thing that could have happened to Bucky? With the knowledge that he gets out of it, with the knowledge that he recovers his memories, and we know how that part of the story goes. So that's one thing that a lot of the fanfic explored. And another thing, it happens in every fandom where people see like a chemistry, a magnetism between two characters, whether or not they actually have a romantic relationship in canon, and they imagine, what if they were in love? But the friendship between Steve Rogers and Bucky, both in the comics and in the movies, is so deep and so strong and so important to both of them that it is the callback to their shared friendship and the catchphrase that they used to say to each other to the end of the line that snaps Bucky out of his brainwashing and is the first push on the road to him remembering himself. That's not a story that you get with every friendship. It's a very deep and very strong friendship. There's strong emotions. It's vitally important to both of them. Each of them is vitally important to the other. And I think people wanted more of that feeling, that sense that here are two characters whose existence is vital to each other. And they wanted to kind of dive into those feelings and explore those feelings and swim around in those feelings. And because you only have a 2-hour movie, you get that in a look in to the end of the line, and Cap being beaten up by Bucky and then finally sacrificing himself, Jesus-like falling from the helicarrier, and Bucky saving him. You get the suicidal limits to which Steve will go in order to redeem Bucky. And people wrote fics, some of them romantic, some of them were recovery fics, imagining what happens after Steve finds him. How does he help him get back his memory? How does he help him get over this enormous trauma that he's been through? There's so much of this story that is emotionally powerful and untold. And that spawned fic like very few fandoms do. So I got very deep into reading a bunch of these, and it kind of satisfied, the urge to explore this story more in more detail than what it gave us.
So the question I have is this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm familiar with the sort of fanfic where the author goes, in the latest episode of my favorite show, there was a guy standing by the elevator for a couple of seconds, so let me write a 17-part saga about him.
Absolutely.
But there's no way to know anything about that guy. He's just an extra. So you have to make stuff up. In this movie, you say there's all this untold backstory, but in the comics, it's told backstory.
Exactly.
So it's interesting to me that there are people who watched the movie and wanted to know more of the backstory, and either didn't want to read the comics to learn it, or did read the comics and decided to disregard them and come up with their own backstory. So why do you think that is?
Well, because I don't think the comics backstory applies to this story. Like I was saying, the way that they portray the treatment that Bucky gets from the Soviets or Hydra or what have you is very different in the comics. The way that Bucky dies is different in the comics. It's kind of like an alternate universe version. This is a retelling of the story. And although I did go to the Winter Soldier arc and read it because I wanted more backstory, it didn't really give me what I was looking for. It gave me Steve angsting about Bucky, and it gave me a bunch of stories about Bucky having spy adventures. And whatever angst there was incredibly cartoony and breastfeedy, and it didn't have the realism and the emotional impact for me that the movies had.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I mean, now that you say that, it does occur to me that there have been plenty of times that a band I like has done a cover song that I've loved, but then I've chased down the original and And maybe the differences aren't even all that pronounced, but it's just enough that it doesn't stir up the same feelings.
Mm-hmm. And here's another point I wanted to make, and this is a personal note. But through this community of people fanboying, fangirling about the movie and writing fic about it, I made all these incredible friends. And that was also a way in which Winter Soldier helped me out of the post-divorce funk. I had a new community with which I was telling these stories of love and compassion and recovery and finding your way again. So there's a community element to it as well.
All right, well, I can't think of a better note on which to wrap up the first episode of Calen-deliria.
Awesome.
So thanks to Stacey Tappan for launching this series with me, especially since she got this in right before hopping on a plane to Thailand to sing in an opera. Thanks to the creators of Captain America, the Winter Soldier for giving us something to talk about, and thank you for listening. I don't have the slightest clue what number 2 will be about or when it'll come out, but whenever it does, I hope you'll come back to check it out. Bye for now.